All right, and we're live. Assalamu alaikum and greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this CICW book talk with Dr. Aliyah Khan from the University of Michigan. Dr. Khan, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Professor Sinanovic, for inviting me.
You're most welcome. So the book that we have in front of us is, I always like to show the book so people can see the cover, is Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean. We have with us Dr. Aliyah Khan, who is an associate professor in the University of Michigan Department of Afro-American and African Studies and the Department of English Language and Literature. She is also director of the Global Islamic Studies Center at the International Institute at the University of Michigan. Dr. Khan specializes in post-colonial Caribbean literature and the contemporary literature of the Muslim and Islamic worlds, with a particular focus on the intersection of race, gender, and Islam in the hemispheric Americas, including in immigrant communities in North America. The book that we are going to discuss today has been well received in a wide variety of academic communities. It is the first academic monograph on the literature, history, and music of Caribbean Islam. The book has received several national awards, honorable mention, the 2021 Modern Language Association Prize for a first book, 2018-2019 American Comparative Literature Association Helen Tartar First Book Subvention Award, and the 2017-2018 American Association of University Women Postdoctoral Research National Fellowship Award. You can also read more about the book in the chat links that I've sent. I also want to welcome our audience, and just before we begin, to lay out the format that we use here. So we usually go through a question and answer format with the author. I'm going to ask several questions of Professor Khan, and she will answer, and we will take about 35 to 40 minutes to that part of the conversation. After that, we're going to engage with you, our audience. So I do hope that in the chat function on YouTube, you will be submitting your comments and questions. And once we're done with our conversation here, then we're going to engage your question. We're going to take your questions and try to answer them and engage in a discussion about it. So the first question that I always ask any author is this: what motivated you to write this book? And how does it relate to your larger academic and or personal interests? What is the main argument of the book?
So first of all, thank you again, Professor Sinanovic, for inviting me here to speak with the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah. And of course, Assalamu alaikum and Ramadan Mubarak to everyone who is celebrating in the audience. So I'll take that question and break it up into two things. In terms of my larger academic or personal interest, the book is very, very personal. I am from the community that I'm writing about, meaning that I'm a Caribbean Muslim. I was born in Guyana and spent all of my childhood there. So it is personal. It is also not just about regional or national belonging. It's that I come from a family of imams. On my maternal grandfather, Muhammad Rashid, he's still an imam in Georgetown in Guyana. His father was an imam, and his father, who was from Lucknow, India, was also an imam. So, it's very personal. I grew up in this world of Caribbean religiosity. So, I wrote the book that I wanted to read when I was a young person. There isn't very much published or written about Caribbean Islam, as you and I were discussing a bit earlier. There are articles, right, in the fields of anthropology and history. There is not very much literary analysis, which is what I do. And perhaps, of course, we should not also be surprised. There are some there's work in the field of security studies more recently after 9/11, which I'm sure that we will get to. But I wanted to do literary analysis, and I also wanted to think about the music of Caribbean Islam. I always say that, the Caribbean is a region that you cannot study or you can't really think about without thinking about its music. It just really suffuses the region, and it's a way that you can tell what's going on with the people culturally, politically. post-colonially and so on through their music. I wanted to bring in all of those diverse manifestations of Caribbean culture in the book. So it's personal in that sense. You also showed everyone the cover. I have it here too. This is a picture of, where is she? This is a picture of this is my grandmother. I put my grandmother on the cover.
Oh, cool.
And this is my mother when she was a child, and this is them on the eve of Guyanese independence in British Guyana. So,
And when was that? The
this
independence?
is, I think the year of this is 1966, which is the same year that Guyana got independence from the British, as many of their Caribbean colonies did post-World War II. So it's very personal, and I'm simultaneously, as Audre Lorde does in her formulation of biomythography, I'm writing the history. I'm writing my own history while writing the history of, I think you could call it, I'm writing the history of my people.
Yeah.
And so it is, not objective in the sense that contemporary, like contemporary scholarship, academic scholarship is supposed to be, thoroughly objective, which I think is a total myth. That such work is, has claims to being objective, but I'm open about, my Foucauldian locus of enunciation. I think it's important to be very open about that. So that's what that is. I also wanted to fill gaps in the archive, right? And establish a canon of Muslim Caribbean literature, which is very much kind of information. And, it's a question of linking all of these disparate sources, as I said. In terms of the second part of your question, the main argument of the book, I wanted to really look at how the Caribbean Muslim subject enters modernity. And so one thing that I focus on is that it is a subject that the Caribbean Muslim subject has kind of always already been racialized. It is something that we think about in the United States as like happening recently, which is just not true at all, right? That like Muslim subjects are racialized, but it is clear maybe clearer in the Caribbean that the Muslim subject was always racialized as either an Indian diasporic or an enslaved African, or, in contemporary times, an Afro-Caribbean revert. So I wanted to establish that this subject has always been racialized, as well as that it is a performative identity that is always in formation and that always has a relationship with the global and with the rest of the Ummah, right? The Muslim community, which makes it which challenges, national and regional narratives of Creolization and hybridity, right? This kind of pre-existing and back and forth relationship between the local and the global that Caribbean Muslims have. And then for women, of course, there is this kind of double performativity of gendered religion. So all of that, racialization, creolization, hybridity, and the ways in which the Muslim subject troubles these pre-existing notions of how that should function in the Caribbean.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for this answer, which really sets up the stage for the rest of our talk so well. But before we move to the next question, I found it interesting that you had to sort of talk about, I know it's not 100% objective. I'm thinking, most of the books, let's say, written about America, the United States, are written by white Americans. Nobody ever questions their objectivity. Nobody brings that into question.
Right.
It is only when somebody from another community is writing about their community, then that objectivity is brought into question. It was just interesting to notice that you had to sort of put that caveat there.
I know.
Which if you were a white American writing about America, you would never even mention it, So it's interesting how it works in even the academia, that we are often, brought into this position where we have to, you're a Muslim and you're writing about Muslims, so you cannot be fully objective, So it has to be written by somebody else, whereas that somebody else can write about their community and would never be questioned on the, on objectivity.
I agree. But what's really helpful for me is that I am not actually an anthropologist. So I don't have to deal with at least that field's conception of what objectivity should be. I mean, my field is critical literary analysis. So I feel freer in some ways to do what I want with that.
No, absolutely. So I think you and I, before we started this live stream, we mentioned how Muslims of the Caribbean are not that well known. And I think, it's a relatively small population that lives on the edges in many ways. So before we move into discussing the book in details, maybe tell us a bit about the Muslim population of the Caribbean. For our audience that may not be well versed in this subject, things such as, for instance, how Islam came to the area, basic demographics, and so on.
Right, right. I mean, it's interesting that you frame it as being on the edges. I don't really know how to we can position them as, marginal on the edges, but one of the things that I want to do is bring them into center, bring them from periphery into center, if we're using that kind of global model. So there are three main groups of Caribbean Muslims. And of course, they have to do with the history, not just about the Caribbean. It's not just about the Caribbean, but it's about the colonial history of the entire Americas, which I always like to think of together, since we usually think of North America as so separate and exceptional. It isn't. The history of Islam in North America is very much tied to the history of the Caribbean and similar. So the first group of people who you could reasonably consider to be Muslim were Moriscos, enslaved Iberians and North Africans who accompanied voyages of Portuguese and Spanish exploration and conquest in the New World. So, we are talking about the 15th century and to some extent, the end of the 15th century, and then of course the 16th century. Most famously, the one person who was Moroccan, who was known as Estebanico. Laila Lalami has written a novel that fictionalizes his life. He was on the Florida Narvaez expedition, that ended not well, as many of them did. She fictionalizes his life in her book. She fictionalizes his life in her book. I always confuse it with The Moor's Last Sigh, Salman Rushdie, but it's not The Moor's Last Sigh. But nonetheless, that's the first wave. But one thing to think about them that is also true of the second group of Muslims is that they left no direct Muslim descendants, right? So they show up in these narratives of the early colonial Caribbean as accompanying these voyages of exploration, but just not leaving any direct descendants behind. The second wave, of course, are people who were brought to the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans, primarily from enslaved Africans from West Africa, from places like Guinea, Senegal, contemporary, what is now present day Nigeria, even Ivory Coast, and so on, that western coast of Africa that so many, at least half of all enslaved people came from. And of course, historians don't really know how many of enslaved Africans who were brought to the New World were Muslim, in the sense that it's hard to tell how many were brought, period. But estimates are something, by historians like Sylviane Diouf and others, that are about 10% or so of enslaved West Africans were probably Muslim. They really had to have been, given where they were from. The slave trading regions of West Africa were not thoroughly Muslim, but very kind of heavily Muslim. We're talking about people who were from Timbuktu in Mali. Of course, they were Muslim.
Yes, of course.
Right. And so they really had to have been. And then, of course, we have records, plantation records that give names of some enslaved people as being called things like Muhammadu, Abu Barika, and so on. And, those people were probably Muslims if they were called Muhammadu and so forth. So, and then as I show in the book, we even have written records, and then we'll get to later, we even have people, literate Muslims, enslaved Muslims, writing their autobiographies. But one thing, again, similar to that first group of people, even though, of course, there were many, many more enslaved West Africans than Moriscos, is that they too left no direct Muslim descendants. And you might, even though there was so many people, of course, it makes sense in the context of chattel slavery. Islam is a book religion. and if you don't have, a religion that is heavily invested in literacy and the ability to read the Quran and the learning of Arabic, how can you possibly maintain that in the conditions of chattel slavery and where reading and writing is forbidden and that kind of thing. Not everybody is going to be a hafiz who can manage to memorize the entire Quran even under the best circumstances. So yes, so they did not leave direct Muslim descendants, even though there were probably quite a few of them. And then that brings us into the more present day, or at least the 19th century, where Islam was brought and preserved into the Anglophone Caribbean by Indian indentured laborers, starting from the 1830s, when the British freed their enslaved people in the Caribbean colonies in 1838 was the first year that they brought indentured Indian laborers from their colony of India, the British Raj, to work on sugar plantations. To fill that labor gap. And so indentureship in the Caribbean lasted between 1838 and 1917, and probably between similar, it's actually similar percentage. So between 6 to 10% of those people were probably Muslim. The vast majority, of course, from the Indian subcontinent were Hindu. So for the longest time, at least in the Anglophone Caribbean, and when I say that, I really mean Guyana and Trinidad, countries that are demographically evenly split between the descendants of African slaves and the descendants of Indian indentured laborers, as well as places like Jamaica, which had sizable minority of Indian indentured laborers, and Suriname on the continent of South America. There are a lot of other islands that got smaller numbers too, like St. Kitts, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, but much, much smaller numbers of people. Nonetheless, those people, since it was more recent and the conditions of indentureship are, of course, very, very harsh, but not the same as chattel slavery, they did preserve both, Christianity, both Hinduism and Islam, and of course, some converted to Christianity too, into the present day. So for the longest time, until at least, the 1980s, 1990s, people in the Caribbean thought of Islam as an Indian religion, rather than as one that, in its earliest manifestation was African. That's changing now with, a lot of Afro-Caribbean converts or reverts to Islam, but it still has in the English-speaking Caribbean that kind of veneer of being thought of as an Indian religion.
That is very interesting. So this brings us to two concepts that you introduce in your book, or that you write quite a bit and use as the framework through which you analyze the global Caribbean Muslim. And those concepts are creolization and hybridity. So can you explain, please, how they related to Islam in the Caribbean, and especially the creation of the global Caribbean Muslim?
Yeah. So of course, we can't really talk about Caribbean analysis, literary analysis, or national post-colonial creation without talking about these concepts of creolization and hybridity. They are foundational to creating the Caribbean subject in the post-colonial era. One thing that I always think about, though, is just, again, the sort of performativity and the way in which the Caribbean Muslim subjectivity is always in flux and always in relation to the global. That is, it's not a static situation. That is the way in which people usually think of hybridity, in particular in the Caribbean, where these very disparate groups end up in the Americas, and then they meld cultures and they assimilate to each other, and then you get something that is a kind of a regionally self-contained blend of the two or the three of, or how many other source cultures there are. But from the inception of the Muslim Caribbean community, it has always been the case that the Caribbean subject has both a local iteration and a global relational iteration in relation to the rest of the Ummah, the Muslim community. So I wanted to think about the ways in which this ongoing relationality to the global is different and troubles the idea of the Caribbean subject as this kind of like preformed hybrid of what has of migration, of the migrant cultures into the Caribbean. I also argue in the book that the metropolitan focus of Caribbean Muslims, I say is in the process of shifting, but really I think that it has already shifted from focus on the Indian subcontinent to the Arab world and to Arabic. And that really started happening in the 1970s with the supplanting of Indian and Pakistani missionaries to the Caribbean, with, interestingly, alignment with Muammar Gaddafi's non-aligned Libya. And
That's interesting.
and we can certainly talk about that, right?
Yeah.
But it has to do with Cold War politics and the non-aligned movement in particular, and its influence, the influence of non-aligned movement and socialism in the Caribbean and in Guyana in particular. But yeah, so the focus, part of this kind of resistance of preformed creolization and hybridity is about this shift in focus from the Indian subcontinent and Indian Islam to Arab Islam. So starting in the 1970s with Libya, as well as, it's really all about where do the young men go and study and what do they bring back with them.
Yeah.
And starting in the 70s, it's that.
And it's mostly men, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not that now, well, now in contemporary, there are some women, but it's still majority of men. Certainly in the 70s and 80s, it was men going to study first. Initially they would go and they would study in India, right, in the first half of the 20th century, or and then what became Pakistan and so on. But now they don't go there, right? They go to Egypt. Previously they went to Libya, but now they go to Egypt, they go to Saudi Arabia itself, and now increasingly with the introduction, let's say, of Gulf Arab wealth and interests into that part of the world, they sometimes go to the UAE to study.
That's interesting too. Yeah, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but I
No,
just like that whole non-aligned movement connection, because I'm from Bosnia. Before Bosnia became independent, it was part of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia is one of the founders of the non-aligned movement. I grew up in school learning about it, and we talked about it quite a bit. And a similar thing happened for Bosnian Muslims, because in the 60s and the 70s, when Tito made this great outreach to the Arab countries that were part and very active in non-aligned movement, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, and so on. Many of the Bosnian Muslims went to study in these countries, not just about Islam, but other things too,
yes,
about Islam as well. And it just brought to my mind, this whole influence of non-aligned movement on global Muslims, from the Caribbean to Bosnia to the Balkans, probably needs to be explored a little more,
I know, yes. No, you're right. You're right. I mean, there are so many like Cold War histories that intersect with Islam that I think are very much understudied. I mean, we've only begun to just really, scholarship has only really begun to even dig at what the Cold War means or meant in the Caribbean, much less there are scholars working on it now, Gayatri Bahadur, Patricia Muhammad, that are thinking about Cold War in the Caribbean, but much less how Islam intersects with that, but it does. And we will see it when you and I talk a little bit more about the 1990 coup, Islamic coup in Trinidad. That definitely is part of the relation to that part of the world.
Yeah, definitely. So I want to bring another thing from your book, which is related to the question that we just talked about. On pages 26, 27, 28, you talk about contemporary global Islam and how it relates to the Caribbean. And you have some of you bring some defining features of that. So maybe can you tell us a little bit more? How is Caribbean Islam or Muslims Caribbean, how are they connected to the global Islam, global Ummah, and how they also create their own particularity within that?
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question, and it manifests in so many different ways that look a little different, look a little different in the Caribbean than they might elsewhere. Doesn't mean that they are not also an iteration of, a global Islamic culture. It is, but okay. So for example, at least in terms of sectarianism, most of the people in the Caribbean are Hanafi Sunnis. So that is just a product of being brought from the Indian subcontinent and then later on, relationality to the Arab world. But what is really one thing that is really interesting is that the minority sect is not they're not Shia. The major minority sect are Ahmadis, who are persecuted in their origin country of Pakistan as non-Muslims. But Ahmadiyat was brought to the Americas, not just the Caribbean, but the United States too, into Black communities in the 1920s by missionaries from what is now from missionaries from Lahore, very, very, very specifically. So as a result of that missionary activity, the vocal minority Muslim group in the Caribbean is are Ahmadis, which is something unusual, right, for most of the rest of the Muslim world. Although it is true that Shias gave the Muslim Caribbean their defining ritual celebration, which is a festival called Hussein, otherwise known as Haram, or Ashura, depending on where you are, that celebrates the martyrdom, or not celebrates, but that commemorates the martyrdom of Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, at the Battle of Karbala. So that turned into a sort of a ritual celebration in the Caribbean that was stamped out by the British because, of course, it brought a lot of people together in the streets, and it was violently stamped out in Trinidad and Guyana in particular by the British, because it was an occasion in which people, there was a lot of cross-racial celebration, right? Black Muslims, not Black Muslims then, but Black Caribbean people participated in them, and so did Hindus and so forth. So of course that was a threat to the colonial regime. So that's one way, in terms of sect, how Caribbean Islam is different. And then there's of course this kind of ongoing relationality, as I said, with music. That is perhaps different. It's not that the Caribbean doesn't have the same exact debates on the same exact theological debates on permissibility of music that everyone else in the world has, and they look the same. There's like fatwas upon debates about vocal music versus instrumental music versus the performance of music at all. But then there is an indigenous form of at least Indo-Caribbean Muslim music that are qasidas, sung in Urdu, that are originally an Arabic form, but I think they really reached an Arabic poetic form, but they really reached their height in the subcontinent as these songs that particularly always praise the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, and especially in the celebration of his birthday, which is something very important to subcontinental Muslims. But again, another source of debate on whether that is bid'ah, innovation, or not. In any case, those qasidas were brought to the Caribbean too, and people sing them. People continue to sing them and compose them ritually. So that is part of Caribbean Muslim culture too. There are a lot of things, but it's not that it doesn't reflect global Muslim culture. The way in which Muslims dress has changed over the last few decades. Religious dress for Muslims, especially because the community was heavily Indian, religious dress used to be shalwar kameez, which they brought with them from the Indian subcontinent, of course, but covering your head too, but with a kind of like more loose, like a more loose garment that resemble a dupatta, called an arni. So just a cloth that's draped over the head. But if you go to the Caribbean now, you will find that a lot of Muslims have adapted a more Gulf Arab style dress, both the men and the women. For example, I was just looking at a picture today of So for some reason, today is one of the days in which the Guyanese government has brought, like, after COVID-19, of course, there was like back and forth in terms of how many students are in school and whatever. But today, the Guyanese government brought back all high school students to school. And I was looking at pictures of like these high school students, just at random high schools around the country. And I noticed that there were so many girls wearing hijab. That would have been very unusual to non-existent when I was a school child in Guyana in the 1980s. So you can really see it visibly.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that is, again, that shows that Caribbean Muslims are part of the global Muslim community, because that's what you're going to find throughout the Muslim world, even in a minority context often.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the transatlantic slave trade earlier, and it played a crucial role in the introduction of Islam to the Caribbean too, at least in the earlier stages. Some of the slaves were highly literate.
Yeah.
And they continued producing literary works after they were brought to the Caribbean, usually with Sufi sensibilities. So can you tell us about some of these works and poetry as well?
Mm-hmm. So it's, again, as I was saying, I'm very interested in establishing a canon, what can be called a canon of Muslim Caribbean literature. And I think, or at least I argue, that it begins with these semi-autobiographical, semi-religious treatises written by enslaved West Africans in the New World. So the ones that I focus on are two from Jamaica. But there are others. In fact, the United States has more of them more of these written documents by enslaved people than anywhere else. So people might be familiar with two in particular: the Ben Ali Diary by Bilali Muhammad from Sapelo Island off the coast of Georgia, or they may also be familiar with Omar ibn Said's The Life of Omar ibn Said, so his autobiography, which is from 1831 and is held by the Library of Congress. So those are the American ones, but there are also others in the Caribbean, in places like Trinidad, Panama, and most obviously the ones that I looked at, which are two from Jamaica. So the two from Jamaica, the most complete one is called, or rather, the translators gave it a name, the Kitab al-Salat, the book on praying, by a man called Muhammad Kabat Saghunugu, who wrote it around the 1820s. He was enslaved in Jamaica for the majority of his West African, enslaved in Jamaica for the majority of his adult life. There is also another one from a gentleman called Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, who was from Timbuktu. And he wrote his, what is a collection of autobiographical fragments, as well as some religious stuff from 1834. And why I say that they have, why it's so important to me to establish that these works have a Sufi lineage is that many of these men were from the highly educated tradition of the Sufi Qadiriya, Tariqa, or Brotherhood. And they were educated in particular West African Sufi traditions that you can see in their work. And in the text that I examine, I focus on the way in which they think about Sufi batin, the idea of the hidden, which is, again, a very Sufi concept. And they're the way in which, so that is something that is definitely traceable and recognizable as Sufi, this concern with what is hidden and what is underneath. Also, they're in the way in which they invoke God. Is very much Sufi, God as the beloved, and calling on God in a very, very personal way. You can see the Sufi roots there. And then in terms of poetry, what I mostly talk about is not so much the poetry of enslaved Africans, because they didn't really write that. What they did is autobiographical fragments, as well as, you can imagine, what they remember. They wanted to record what they remembered of their religion from West Africa. So, they did things like record things that their teachers had said, after they established the lineage of the teachers, sayings and doings of their teachers, but also guides on how to pray. What would you need as a Muslim in the New World, right? You need a primer. So
Yes.
there's some of that kind of primer stuff. So but the poetry comes a little bit later when I talk about the poetry of Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson, who is a poet of the 20th century, Derek Walcott, Kamal Brathwaite, Caribbean poet generation, except much less well known, partially because he's from Guyana, which has a a kind of strange relationship with the Caribbean in that, we consider ourselves to be an Anglophone Muslim country, sorry, an Anglophone Caribbean country. That was a Freudian slip. We are an Anglophone Muslim country. But we are in South America. It's just that we don't speak Spanish or Portuguese and have much more culturally in common with the rest of the Caribbean, colonially, I guess, in common with the rest of the Caribbean. In any case, he was from there and he converted to Islam in 1964. And, at least maybe half of his poetry is, invokes Sufi themes and again calls on God as the beloved, and so forth. But there is not very much analytical work written on his poetry because I think that Caribbean critics who are most usually familiar with themes of post-colonialism and so on, they just don't know what to do with these Muslim themes, these Islamic themes in Caribbean poetry. So, I take a big step of calling him the poet laureate of the Muslim Caribbean, which I think he is, because there is no one else who writes or has written so visibly as a Caribbean Muslim as Abdurrahman Slade Hopkinson has. He died in 1992, and you can find his some of his more well-known works collected in this volume called Snowscape with Signature, where it's clear that so much of his he even directly invokes his intercessors like Rumi, of course, and some who are less well known, but his poetic interlocutors are clear. He names them.
So thank you. And I assume that some of these books and poetry would be obtainable in the United States as well. Okay.
Absolutely.
So in another chapter of the book, you introduce the Indo-Caribbean Muslim woman as one of the main protagonists of the book. Tell us more about this and how they feature within the literary traditions of the Caribbean, including some real examples of Muslim women's agency.
So I introduce non-Caribbean readers to this term. I'll start off with the term fullaman, which is a term that Guyanese and to a lesser extent Caribbean people use to call Muslims of any ethnicity or race. So but the origin of it is something really interesting and worth thinking about. So a fullaman, or the term fullaman, comes from Fulla or Fulani, West African tribal people who were enslaved in Guyana and in the Americas. And then so that term creolizes into something called fullaman, that can be applied to in a somewhat derogatory way Muslims of any ethnicity now in the Caribbean. Trinidad has a similar term that derives from a West African tribal name. They will call, colloquially, they'll call any Muslim, they'll call them Madinga or Mandinga, which is very clearly from the West African tribe. Mandinka or Mande. So, what is so interesting to me is that these terms survived into the present day as a signifier of someone that is Muslim, even though their origin group, enslaved Muslim West Africans, didn't survive as a Muslim community.
Interesting.
The term for Muslim still survives. So I gendered this term, right? Usually we think of it as, a term that relates to Muslims, like these very highly literate Muslims that I mentioned, who produce these autobiographies and so on. But I want to think about, well, we have no such written works by enslaved Muslim women in the Caribbean, right? We almost have no slave narratives at all by Muslim women in the Caribbean. There's just really one that's from the Bahamas. but that is from anyone at all. That's from the Bahamas, and there are none by enslaved Muslim African women. So that, that we know of. But so I want to think of like, what is it? And then of course, like, what is it in relation to the Indo-Caribbean in particular? So one thing that I thought about was the way in which Indo-Caribbean femininity is always and has always been historically colonially opposed to Afro-Caribbean femininity and Afro-Caribbean gendered manifestations. So what I wanted to think about was how the fuller woman, let's say, crosses those categories and does not adhere to the strict division between Indian femininity and womanhood and African femininity and womanhood. Because of course, in the Caribbean, the fuller woman could be either. Right? Is a very unique category. The Muslim woman, who could be either Indian or could be African or could be Black, which is very unique in the Caribbean, where race is usually associated with religion, but Islam crosses that boundary. And then in terms of a concrete example, I interviewed a doctor, a woman who's a doctor. She's an oncologist now, but in her youth, her name is Anisa. She was a very active Muslim in Trinidad at a mosque called the Fireburn Masjid in Freeport, Trinidad. And what she did, her name is Anisa Ahmad. What she did was she gave the first khutbah, the first Jummah khutbah on a Friday in the Caribbean that was ever given by a Muslim woman in 1995. So there are women giving khutbahs today, right, who have broken that barrier. People like Amina Wadud and so on, but this woman, Anisa Ahmad, was the first to do that in the Caribbean in 1995 in Trinidad. And it caused a stir in Trinidad that a woman would give a khutbah. Essentially, you can imagine the scene. This is a woman standing up in front of a mixed gender audience to give a post-prayer khutbah. And so, there's a lot of criticism of it, but also a lot of, very interestingly, pride from the Muslim community, and of course, international interest. The BBC descended on Trinidad to interview Muslims to ask them what they thought in 1995 that a woman had given the khutbah. So that is momentous.
So was this a khutbah, like a khutbah as a part of the regular khutbah, or was it a talk given after the Friday prayer? It
was the real khutbah.
It was the real khutbah.
Yeah.
And the community accepted it. They didn't find it problematic. The local community.
In fact, when I talked to her, she told me that she was encouraged by the imam and the older male members of the masjid to do it. They want, in some sense, they wanted to be the first. Okay, they wanted to be the first. Okay, so that's part of it. They wanted to be the first to do something like that. But they also, again, this goes to thinking about, we think of where do we place the Caribbean in this like unfortunate East-West binary when we're thinking about Muslims? Like, people always are, don't include the Caribbean in the Western side, but of course it's in the Americas. In any case, there's certainly a part of the Muslim sentiment, at least at her masjid, that wanted to be the first to do something like that. But they were also encouraging. She said they were encouraging of her because they viewed her as an educated woman. She was educated, so that she would be able to represent the community in some particular way, because she was educated. She was educated not just secularly, but also religiously. So she was picked, in a sense, by she wasn't a random person. She was kind of handpicked.
So was this one-off, or has that tradition continued after that of women?
It has tradition. It was not a one-off, but it's certainly not common. It's not that it established it just established this whole new thing. It is not uncommon, in particular in Ahmadi mosques in Trinidad. I think you would be very hard pressed to see it in a Sunni mosque.
Okay. All right. So yeah, that's such a fascinating concept that you introduced, and I really like how you describe that concept for a woman as crossing different racial identities in a way that, you know, for many Caribbeans, religion is often racialized. I
Right.
mean, as it is often in much of the rest of the world, and to see how this Muslim subject, if you will, is able to cross those boundaries and bring them together is quite interesting to me. Now, I'm aware that that the time is you know, is tight a little bit, but I want us to talk about this fascinating thing, and that is the attempted coup
Yes.
led by Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, the leader of the Jamaat al-Muslimeen.
Mhm.
So, you know, just thinking about a Muslim group attempting a coup in a country in which there are just a few percentage of the
Very
population,
strange.
and
Yeah.
so on, it's such a strange thing. And also considering this happened in 1990, this wasn't a more recent thing, you know, after 9/11 or something like
Nope.
that.
Mhm.
So, can you tell us what was the coup about? What was its outcome? And you also in this chapter introduced the concept of Muslim time. So, if you could tell us more about that.
Yeah. So again, this is a really fascinating thing to think of a Islamic coup happening in the Caribbean, but it did happen in 1990, led by Imam Yassin Abu Bakr, who, to tie it back to part of our earlier conversations, he had ties to Libya and Muammar Gaddafi's non-aligned movement, or not Muammar Gaddafi's Muhammad Gaddafi's Muslim movement in Libya, but also the non-aligned movement. In any case, so he's the leader of the Jabatal Muslim, which very interestingly was a predominantly Afro-Caribbean Muslim group, Afro-Trinidadian Muslim group. So that is the first time that the Caribbean public became aware that Black people were also Muslim, right? Because again, they were thinking that only Indians were Muslim. So that's one thing that the coup did, even without being, you know, even without being the rest of its political ramifications. So the coup was not so much about, you know, establishing an Islamic caliphate, let's say in Trinidad, or, you know, doing, you know, establishing like an Islamic state or something like that. The Jabatal Muslim had pre-existing issues with the government, the Trinidadian government, over corruption, police corruption in particular, the narco drug trade, and those kinds of conflicts. They just simply thought they would do better as a government than the government was doing. And they hoped that once they took over the Red House, which is the seat of parliament in Trinidad, for about 6 days in 1990. It was an armed coup of 114 men, lasted about 6 days. They took over the parliament. They also took over Trinidad and Tobago's, at that point, single television and radio station, and firebombed a bunch of other public buildings and attempted to take them over too. And they wanted the population to revolt, but the population did not, in fact, revolt
Against the government.
They instead, what happened was widespread mass looting. That's what happened.
Oh.
That's more the outcome. And then Abu Bakr and his cohorts were, you know, they technically received amnesty, but were jailed for 2 years. And he only died in 2020, in October 2020. And he was still the leader of the Jamaat al-Muslimeen, which was a, you know, much diminished group of, again, predominantly Afro-Trinidadian Muslims. But, you know, the coup had an outsized impact from its actual achievements, which were none really in terms of taking over the government. But it, again, introduced the Caribbean public to the idea that Muslims even existed at all. Because again, a minority group that had kind of laid low until then, so Muslims existed at all in the Caribbean, that Muslims could be Black as well as Indian, disrupting that racialization. And I argue in the book that it is this watershed moment that is, I guess, to some extent, our 9/11, that brings Muslims into public discourse in a very noticeable and concerted way, and associates Muslims with this kind of revolutionary threat which segues very well into the second part of the question, which is Muslim time. So Muslim time is a concept that I borrow from the Trinidadian calypsonian musicians David Rudder's song Hussein, which is about the coup. There are a lot of calypso songs written for Carnival 1991, the year after the coup, written about the coup, and that was one of them. So what the song offers us when it constructs this term Muslim time is that it is when Islam enters public discourse as a revolutionary threat in the Caribbean, and that comes in 1990 with the coup. And I was able to interview Imam Abu Bakr for the book before he passed away. And he is a big time calypso fan and music fan, again, thinking about music in the Caribbean. So can you imagine one of the things that he did was when he took over Trinidad, like when he staged this armed takeover of Trinidad's radio station, Trinidad's national radio station, in addition to the invectives against the government, he played over national radio his favorite calypso songs. So imagine this like Islamic coup, it's very incongruous. Yeah. So imagine this Islamic coup leader taking over the government and just playing his favorite music on the airwaves.
That's so Caribbean in a way.
So Caribbean, exactly.
Yeah, that is so interesting. And you did mention that you interviewed him, and of course, in the book, it's very clear that you interviewed him. I think it was 2017 or 2018 when you interviewed him for the book. But which is valuable because, like you said, he passed away 2 years ago, and any kind of documentary evidence and interviews are really important. If you could maybe just tell us, one thing. So Muslim time here does not refer to being habitually late, right?
Let me tell you something. When you compound Muslim time with Caribbean time, in which I have been to events that, start literally 3 hours late, forget it. You might as well, come the next day.
Okay. So it does exist. Let's put it that way. Okay, very good. If you could maybe just briefly tell us about this group, Jabatal Muslim. What are they about? Are they in any way similar to any of the existing groups that exist somewhere else in the Muslim world? Is it something that is very generic and one-off for the Caribbean Muslims?
Yeah, so the Jabatal Muslim, again, part of it stems with Abu Bakr's relationship with Muammar Gaddafi's Libya and his affiliation with these Dawah outreach groups that come out of Libya, which still have an impact they still have a legacy, not an impact. They still have a legacy in the Caribbean. So it was not a one-off, but certainly a product. It's a local product of post-colonial Trinidadian politics, right, and conflict with the government. But he did have, again, the constant relationality of global Islam. He did have ties to the rest of the Muslim world. But this is a different Cold War story than the contemporary war on terror now, right? And as we're going to say, any echoes of 9/11 and Muslims in the Caribbean, they do exist.
Mm-hmm. And that's going to be our next, so to say, question or next stop. Of course, we need to talk about the 21st century transformations of Caribbean Islam. And I think you already mentioned quite a bit that in the beginning, this shift from more kind of Indian-centered Islam to more Arab-centered Islam and so on.
Yeah.
But then, of course, we have 9/11 that impacts Muslims globally, including Muslims in Caribbean. So what were the echoes of 9/11 among Muslims in that region?
Mm-hmm. So the Caribbean, or at least the Anglophone Caribbean, is of course heavily influenced by U.S. Discourse on Muslims, which is in English, and these are English-speaking countries too. What's funny is the very first ramification or very first effect of 9/11 and the Caribbean is that Imam Abu Bakr and the Jabatal Muslimeen's compound was searched by the Trinidadian government shortly after 9/11, because the Trinidadian government was kind of casting around to like, who could we like suspect as a possible Muslim terrorist in Trinidad? And of course, they still existed. So their compound was searched, came up with nothing. It was, for the longest time, many Trinidadians and many Caribbean people suspected Abu Bakr of having ties with the Islamic State, and having ties with other groups, Al-Qaeda and so on, that are implicated in the contemporary quote unquote war on terror. But I really don't think that that's the case. I think it's other people. I don't think it was him, and I don't think it was the contemporary Jamaat al-Muslimeen. So, because, their day has passed, and their concerns are much more local. They're about local government and so on. But we should also say too that at least 100 or so people between 2013 and 2016 traveled to Syria, and Syria and Iraq. They traveled there to fight for the Islamic State, much as people from other places in the world did too. And there are some things that are notable about the group of Caribbean nationals that went there. So primarily they were Trinidadian and some Jamaicans as well. But the notable things about them were demographically were that the majority were probably Afro-Caribbean, which is again unusual in that cultural context. And there were also a lot of women. Going primarily as family groups, but there were more women than you might expect. For the most part, those people are not associated with Abu Bakr's Jamaat al-Muslimeen, but the ones in Trinidad are mostly associated with a Muslimeen splinter group that broke off from them right after the coup, led by this guy named Imam Nazim Muhammad. And the location of their mosque is in a place called Rio Claro in Trinidad. A lot of the people who traveled to Syria came from that particular mosque. And Nazim Muhammad, a lot of his family members too went to, in the teens of his family member went to fight for the Islamic State. And then his daughter was imprisoned in Baghdad in 2018. For involvement with the Islamic State. So, there again, Muslims are involved in contemporary global politics. We even had our own feature in the Islamic State magazine, if you remember from that time, Dabik.
Yes.
Yeah, so one feature was about a guy who formerly known as Shane Crawford, but of course, his kunya, his nom de guerre was Abu Saad at Trinidadi, which is so strange, the way they do those kunyas. But he had this big interview in Dabik about how Caribbean nationals do very well in the Islamic State because they speak English, and they're good fighters and so forth. So. He was designated the United States government named him a specially designated terrorist in February 2017. And not coincidentally, he was killed in a drone strike in February 2017. Yes, the Caribbean Muslims' relationality and position in global Islam is in this case not dissimilar from the rest of the world.
Yeah. So I just want to recognize our audience once again, and as we are coming to closer to the end of our talk, and we're going to, once you and I have concluded this conversation, take a few questions and comments from the audience, and I see that we have a couple of those. I'd just like to encourage the audience to submit your questions in the chat function on YouTube. And I want to ask you this final question. I know we could talk about this book for hours, and it's really such a rich book, and I strongly recommend it to everybody to read it. We've only scratched really the surface of the book. So what would you say are the main takeaways of the book?
I can do this in a soundbite, or I can do it very long, but let's try the soundbite first. Okay. So I want to establish that Muslims have been a part of Caribbean history since the earliest colonial era, and that Islam is an ancestral religion of both Africans and Indians in the Caribbean. Even though they are often in conflict, they are not in this way. And it is certainly a point of unity. I also want to establish that we can't define Caribbean Muslim history in US terms, using 9/11 as our benchmark and American national discourse as our benchmark, since we have our own history and our own events to pay attention to that even precede 9/11. It's also true too that I want to make the point that the Caribbean is an instructive case for racialized citizenship discourse that surrounds the Muslim subject in the Americas, because Muslims in the Caribbean are a settled labor and migrant diaspora. They're not new immigrants the way that Muslims are framed as in the United States. So maybe they're in some ways a predictive case of what might happen with Islam in the future in immigrant communities in North America.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. I think we've all learned a lot. So now let me turn to some of the comments in our chat. So Suleiman Bulbulia is joining us from Barbados.
Oh, nice.
And he said, regarding the history of Muslims in the region, there is a body of research that suggests the presence of African Muslims in the region before Columbus. I think this has been, historiographers have shown that there are some traces of that and so on. I don't know, I think it's more of a comment. I don't know if you want to engage it, you're definitely welcome to do so. Dr. Khan, if you want to say something about this particular.
Yeah, I mean, I know the strain of work that you're talking about, that the questioner is talking about. It depends, right, on if you believe in pre-contact or in like pre-Columbian contact between indigenous people and Islam, or if you believe that Muslims from West Africa in particular made it to the New World before. I mean, it is not mainstream narrative. It is not mainstream scholarship. It is not mainstream historical scholarship, but certainly it would depend on if you believe that that's the case.
Yeah. Okay. And Suleiman also mentioned that he passed away October 2021. I think this refers to Imam Yassin, October 2021. Okay. We also have Zariab from the United Kingdom, from the UK, mentions the Calypso song Prayer for Abu Bakr.
Yes.
And then has a question, which I think you did mention this in your talk. How far did neoliberal policies and corruption in Jamaica influence Abu Bakr to take up arms against the government? I think you did talk about that. And if there's anything you would like to add here.
Yeah, I mean, it's Trinidad, but yes, as I said, it's a combination of issues. Police corruption. Abu Bakr had this very particular story in which he felt like he was avenging the death of a policewoman, of a very particular policewoman that he knew. He used to be a policeman himself before his before he became a Muslim and an imam and so on. So there's that, but there's also too. They were protesting the narco trade in Trinidad and the introduction and the way in which cocaine in particular passes through the Caribbean on its way to North America. All of those things, just educational opportunities, like right before his death in 2020, Abu Bakr was still on, he did this spot on Facebook Live. So the guy was, he was almost 80 years old and doing spots on Facebook Live, railing against the government and how they were not properly educating children and not properly educating Afro-Trinidadian children in particular. So it's all of these kind of domestic social concerns.
Yeah, thanks. So Suleiman Bulbulia has another question. He's asking, how do you feel of Guyana having its first Muslim president?
Yes, so Guyana does have its first Muslim president, Irfan Ali, and I mean, kudos to him. In the sense that I would say, kudos to anyone else. It's probably about time, right? That particular minority religious group is represented. I know that he has made a big effort to be ecumenical. Recently, he instituted a national day of prayer. That very very visibly and very consciously brought the three major religions in Guyana into conversation with each other in this very visible way in schools and so on. So Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism. I saw all of this. I saw all of these like celebratory signs that had symbols from every single religion, from all three religions on it in this very deliberate kind of way. So I mean, the Caribbean is a very religious place. Like we usually think of it as this, or at least in North America, we usually think of the Caribbean as some place that is about tourism and beaches and sand and sea and sun and so forth. But people in the Caribbean, regardless of what their religion is, they tend to be very, unusually, maybe for North Americans to conceptualize, they tend to be fairly religious people.
Very committed to their traditions and to. Yeah.
I mean, many of them are, at least in the Anglophone Caribbean, many of them are Christian. And the vast majority of Afro-Caribbean people are Christian. I mean, and we're not just talking about the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church, the colonial church. A lot of people now identify as evangelicals in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and that's been the case in Latin America, which traditionally, you know, tends to be Catholic, but more and more we see inroads that the evangelicalism had made in that part of the world as well. So let me see if we have any more questions. Just for those of us who might not know, so Guyana has a Muslim president. What's the percentage of Muslim population of Guyana?
So Guyana has suffered, as a lot of the world has, from an extreme brain drain starting in the 1970s, and the percentage of population is in flux. The number ranges, at its height, it was about 10%, maybe in the 70s or so. I'd say it's probably a little bit less now. It always fluctuates. Like Trinidad, the range is between 6 and 10%. Trinidad tends to be a little bit around 6 usually. Guyana tends to be a little bit around 10.
Okay. Very good. Well, I think I'm not seeing any more questions or comments, so I would like to bring our conversation to closure here. First of all, I want to thank you so much. This was such a fascinating conversation, such a learning journey, I think, for many of us who are not that well familiar with the Caribbean Muslims. And this book is really an eye-opener, and I really congratulate you for writing it. It's also a well-researched, well-written book, and I highly, highly recommend it to everyone to read it. So once again, Professor Aliyah Khan, Professor Aliyah Khan, I am very, very thankful and grateful to you for joining us today. I wish you the best for the rest of the Ramadan and at the end of the semester. And yeah, thanks once again, and thank you to our audience for joining us, for being interactive with us. And we do have one more comment by Mr. Suleiman. He said, Muslims of CARICOM is a recent publication by Sabir Nahuda over Barbados, and gives a good historical perspective on Muslims of the Caribbean. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Yes. Thank you too for inviting me again, Dr. Sinanovich, and thanks to the audience for listening and for their questions.
Absolutely. That was another CICW Book Talk, Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Trinidad University. My name is Erwin Sinanovich. I'm the Executive Director of the Center. I thank you all for joining us, and I hope you will join us for our future book talks. Thank you, and Salaam Alaikum.